My name is Rowena Hale. I'm 35 years old, and as I'm writing this, I'm sitting alone at my kitchen table, my phone face down beside a cold cup of tea I forgot to drink. My hands aren't shaking anymore, but that's only because I've gone numb. I think my relationship with my boyfriend of 3 years ended tonight. Not with yelling, not with slammed doors, not even with a proper goodbye. It ended at a dinner table, under dim lights and crystal glassware, with a sentence that landed so cleanly it felt surgical. I'm a dentist. More specifically, I co-founded a cosmetic dental practice in Seattle 5 years ago. I didn't inherit it. I didn't marry into it. I built it with loans, secondhand equipment, and years of 12-hour days. We started in a cramped office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. Now we operate out of a licensed, modern clinic with 8 staff members and a growing patient base. I'm proud of what I do. I help people feel confident when they smile. I know exactly how much work that takes. Apparently tonight, I learned that wasn't enough. My boyfriend, Evan, is 29. He comes from what people politely call established money. His family lives on Mercer Island, in a waterfront home that looks less like a house and more like a quiet statement about permanence. We met 3 years ago at a charity gala. He was on the organizing committee. I was one of the sponsors. My practice had donated a smile makeover package. We talked about architecture, hiking trails, and how Seattle manages to feel both intimate and cold at the same time. He was charming in a contained way, polished, observant. I mistook that for depth. For most of our relationship, I genuinely believed we were moving towards something permanent. We'd browsed engagement rings once. Casually, he said, like it was a joke that lingered too long to actually be funny. I let myself imagine a future anyway. His family, though, had always been particular. His father runs an investment firm tied to luxury real estate. His mother sits on the boards of several cultural institutions. Conversations with them felt less like getting to know someone and more like an interview you didn't realize you were failing. Still, I tried. God, did I try. When a pipe burst in their lake house last winter, I spent an entire weekend helping repair tile because the contractor couldn't come until Monday. When Evan's mother's photographer canceled last minute during a rebrand, I took professional photos myself. I even coordinated their entire family reunion one summer when the event planner backed out. 30 people, multiple locations, endless dietary restrictions. People called me helpful, practical. Once someone said I was refreshingly service-oriented. I laughed it off at the time. Tonight, Evan's father invited us to dinner at an upscale steakhouse in Capitol Hill, the kind of place where prices aren't listed and the waitstaff glide instead of walk. I thought stupidly that this might be a turning point. Evan had been nervous all day, pacing more than usual, adjusting his watch like it suddenly didn't sit right on his wrist. I mistook that for anticipation. The restaurant was dim and elegant. White tablecloths, low voices. The clink of cutlery sounded louder than it should have. We were halfway through the main course when his father set his knife down carefully and cleared his throat. That sound, controlled, deliberate, should have warned me. I think it's time we had a frank discussion about your future together, he said, swirling his wine. He looked at me only briefly before turning to Evan. My son needs a partner with broader ambitions than cosmetic dentistry. The words themselves weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. He said cosmetic dentistry the way someone might say hobby or phase. Something indulgent. Temporary. I didn't respond right away. I looked at Evan. I waited. In that space, those few seconds where silence stretches just long enough to become meaning, I expected him to speak, to correct his father, to say anything that indicated we were on the same side of this table. Instead, Evan inhaled slowly, eyes dropping to his plate. Then he said, "Dad's not wrong, Rowena. I've been thinking about this too. We need to be realistic about the future." He still didn't look at me. His mother reached across the table and placed her hand lightly over mine, her touch cool and brief. "You're a lovely young woman," she said softly. "We've truly enjoyed getting to know you." Enjoyed. Past tense. That was the moment something inside me went very still. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't defend my career or list my accomplishments or remind them of every weekend and favor and compromise. I realized all at once that none of it would matter. Not because they didn't understand, but because they already had. I placed my napkin on the table, stood up. "Thank you for dinner," I said. My voice didn't shake. Then I walked out. That was 4 hours ago. Since then, Evan has called me 12 times. He sent messages, long ones, judging by the preview notifications, but I haven't opened a single one. I don't need to read them to know what they say. Explanations, rationalizations, concern framed as care. I keep replaying the moment in my head. Not the insult itself, but the way Evan agreed with it. The way he chose alignment over loyalty. The way he let his father define my worth, while he sat there and said nothing until it was time to agree. Looking back now, the signs feel obvious in a way that makes my chest ache. The way Evan deflected whenever I asked about our future with his family. How he never corrected his mother when she referred to my practice as your dental office, as if it were a side project instead of the culmination of everything I'd built. How he introduced me at work events as, "This is Rowena, she's a dentist," without pride, without context, just a label, stripped down to its least impressive version. The worst part isn't even losing him. It's realizing I spent 3 years trying to earn approval from people who had already decided I wasn't enough, and that the man I loved was willing to let me keep trying. I'm not going back, I know that much. There are things you can't unhear, moments that permanently alter how you see someone. Tonight was one of them. 3 years is a long time to waste. And yet somehow, I feel like this might be the first honest moment I've had in all of them. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the city breathe outside my window, the low hum of traffic, the distant siren that never quite reaches you, the soft click of my heater turning on and off. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back at that table, watching Evan study his plate like it held the answer to a question he didn't want to say out loud. By morning, the shock had faded. What replaced it was worse. Clarity. When I met Evan 3 years ago, I thought I'd gotten lucky. It was at a charity gala downtown. Black tie, soft jazz, people holding champagne flutes like accessories instead of drinks. My practice had sponsored a cosmetic smile makeover package. Evan was part of the organizing committee, effortlessly polished in a tailored suit, moving through the room like he belonged everywhere at once. We started talking about architecture first, then hiking. He knew the names of trails I loved, the kind that take real effort to reach, the kind where you earn the view. I remember thinking he seemed curious in a quiet way, not flashy, not loud, just refined. I didn't realize how much I was filling in the blanks for him. We moved fast. Dinners turned into weekends. Weekends turned into drawers, left half full in each other's apartments. Evan liked that I was independent. Or at least, he liked saying he did. He admired my work ethic, my focus. He told people I was driven, which I mistook for respect. His family was a different story. The first time I went to their house on Mercer Island, I felt like I'd stepped into a museum curated by wealth. Everything had a history. Every piece of furniture came with a story about where it was sourced or who had owned it before. There were framed photos of Evan at different stages of life: boarding school, sailing competitions, European summers. I didn't see myself anywhere in that future, but I told myself that was normal. Families take time. His parents were always polite, impeccably so. They asked about my work, but only enough to confirm I had one. Conversations never lingered there. When they talked about ambition, they meant scale, influence, leverage. Words that floated just above what I did, never quite touching it. Still, I tried to bridge the gap. When their lake house flooded after a pipe burst, I didn't hesitate. I spent 2 days on my knees helping fix tile, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back, listening to Evan's father complain about unreliable contractors. When his mother's photographer canceled at the last minute, I brought my camera and shot her rebrand materials myself. When their family reunion needed organizing, I became the organizer. At some point, helping turned into proving. And I didn't notice when appreciation quietly became expectation. Evan never stopped me. He never asked if I was tired or if I felt uncomfortable. He'd just smile, squeeze my hand, and say, "They really like you, you know." Looking back, I don't think that was true. I think they liked what I provided. There were moments, small ones, that should have stopped me cold. Like how Evan introduced me at his work events. "This is Rowena, she's a dentist." No mention of the practice, no pride, no context. Just a title, stripped bare. I noticed how he spoke about his friends' careers with enthusiasm, how he leaned in when their successes came up. When it was my turn, the conversation drifted elsewhere. Not maliciously, just easily. When we talked about the future, Evan loved discussing the aesthetics of it, the wedding venue, the neighborhood we might live in, the kind of life it would look like from the outside. But whenever I asked how his parents fit into that picture, he'd deflect. They're just traditional, he'd say. They'll come around. You know how they are. I told myself every family had quirks, that love required patience, that compromise was part of adulthood. What I didn't want to admit was this: Evan never once challenged them on my behalf. Not publicly, not privately, as far as I could tell. And the more successful my practice became, the more carefully neutral he seemed about it, as if celebrating too much might provoke something. A few months ago, we casually browsed engagement rings. He framed it as hypothetical, playful. I remember watching his reflection in the glass, searching his face for certainty. I didn't see it, but I ignored that too. I see now that I spent 3 years adjusting myself, smoothing my edges, making sure I was impressive but not threatening. Accomplished, but not inconvenient. Tonight, at that dinner, the truth finally surfaced. Not as a surprise, but as confirmation. Evan didn't betray me in a single moment. He just stopped pretending. And I stopped pretending with him. I waited until the next evening to read Evan's messages. Not because I was trying to be dramatic. I just needed the distance to let the noise inside my head settle enough that I wouldn't read his words and immediately start justifying them for him. By then, there were over 20 texts. Missed calls scattered between them like punctuation. The first few were predictable. Can we talk? Last night got out of hand. You walked out before we could explain. Explain. I kept scrolling. My dad shouldn't have said it like that. You know he doesn't always express himself well. I never meant for you to feel attacked. Still nothing that mattered. There wasn't a single line that said, he was wrong. There wasn't a single sentence that said, I defended you. I set the phone down, just as there was a knock at my door. It wasn't loud, not aggressive, just firm enough to say he wasn't going to leave without being acknowledged. When I opened it, Evan stood there, shoulders squared, hair slightly out of place, like he'd run a hand through it one too many times. His expression wasn't desperate. It was controlled, careful. The same face he wore in uncomfortable meetings. Can we talk? He asked. I hesitated for half a second, then stepped aside. 5 minutes. He walked in and paced once across my living room, stopping near the window like he needed something solid behind him. I stayed where I was, arms relaxed at my sides, watching him like a stranger I was assessing for risk. You have to understand where they're coming from, he started. My parents just want what's best for me, for us. And I'm not what's best for you? I asked. That's not what I said. It's what you meant, I replied, my voice even. He exhaled slowly, running his hand along the back of his neck. They're worried about long-term security, stability, optics. Optics, I repeated. Is that what my career is to you? He didn't answer right away, his jaw tightened, then released. Rowena, you're amazing at what you do, he said carefully. No one's denying that. That's not the question, I said. Do you disagree with what your father said about me? About my profession? He looked at the floor. 5 seconds passed. Then 6. That silence hit harder than the insult at the table ever had. I think, he said finally, choosing each word like it might explode, that maybe there are other directions you could explore. Within dentistry, something with more growth, something that would help them see your potential. There it was. Not a defense, a suggestion for correction. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, certainty. So this isn't about them, I said quietly. This is about you agreeing with them. That's not fair, he said, turning toward me now. His voice stayed level, but there was a defensive edge to it. I'm just being realistic. No, I said, you're being comfortable. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I walked past him and opened the door. You should go. Rowena, we're done, I said. I don't want to negotiate my worth with you or your family. For a moment, he stood there like he might argue, like he might push. But he didn't. He nodded once, sharp and restrained, then walked out without another word. I closed the door and locked it. Then I blocked his number, his social media, every shared thread that connected us. The aftermath wasn't dramatic. There was no collapse, no sobbing on the floor. There was just this dull, aching rotation of emotions. Anger in the morning, grief in the afternoon, self-doubt creeping in late at night. I questioned myself in ways I hadn't in years, wondered if I should have said more, if I'd been too rigid, too proud. But every time I replayed that silence, the 5 seconds where he couldn't say he disagreed, I knew I'd made the right choice. Because love doesn't hesitate when you're being diminished, and anyone who does isn't choosing you. The week after Evan left my apartment blurred into something mechanical. I woke up, went to work, came home, repeated. On the surface, nothing in my life had changed. My practice still opened at the same hour. Patients still filled the chairs. My staff still asked me questions. trusted my judgment, relied on me to be steady. And I was, outwardly. Inside, everything had narrowed. I stopped thinking about Evan as a person and started thinking about him as a decision I'd made and then corrected. That shift mattered more than I realized at the time. For the first few days, I let myself feel it. The anger came in short, sharp bursts. Not explosive, just focused. The grief was quieter, heavier, like something pressing down on my chest when I tried to sleep. The self-doubt was the most insidious. It slipped in during idle moments, whispering questions I didn't consciously invite. Was I too inflexible? Should I have tried harder to explain? Did I walk away too fast? Then one night, I stayed late at the clinic reviewing case files and realized something uncomfortable. I'd been holding back. Not because I lacked ambition, but because somewhere along the way, I'd learned to soften it, to make it more palatable, to avoid looking like the kind of woman who scared people with how focused she was. That realization made me angry in a way that felt productive. So I stopped holding back. There were expansions I'd been postponing for over a year, certifications I wanted but hadn't pursued because they required time, money, and energy. And I'd been worried about seeming too career-driven. I'd convinced myself there was virtue in restraint. That narrative died quietly, without ceremony. I enrolled in an advanced aesthetic dentistry certification program I'd bookmarked months earlier and never clicked. It meant weekends gone, long nights, more debt. I signed up anyway. We gutted one of our existing treatment rooms and rebuilt it into a dedicated smile design studio. High-resolution imaging, digital mock-ups, patient consultation space that allowed people to actually see what was possible before committing. I approved the equipment upgrade without second-guessing myself. We hired a treatment coordinator, someone whose sole job was to guide patients through the process instead of rushing them in and out. It wasn't cheap. It was necessary. Every decision felt like reclaiming something. I worked 12-hour days without complaint, not out of desperation, but because for the first time in months, my focus felt clean, undiluted. When I left the clinic late at night, exhaustion followed me home. But it wasn't the hollow kind. It was earned. And slowly, the results started coming in. Patients noticed. Referrals increased. Consultations filled weeks in advance. 3 months after the renovation was completed, our bookings were up 40%. 40. Not a projection. Not a hopeful estimate. Real numbers. My staff felt it too. The energy shifted. There was momentum now. Direction. One evening, I stayed late after closing, standing alone in the new consultation space. The lights were off, except for the soft glow from the imaging screens. I caught my reflection in the glass. Tired, yes, but grounded. For the first time since that dinner, I didn't feel dismissed. I felt dangerous in the best possible way. What surprised me most wasn't the success. It was the quiet that followed it. Evan didn't cross my mind the way he used to. Not constantly, not painfully. When I thought of him, it was with distance, not bitterness, just clarity. The relationship hadn't failed because I wasn't enough. It failed because I'd outgrown the role I was expected to play. I didn't tell many people what had happened between us. I didn't need sympathy. I didn't need validation. The work spoke loudly enough. And somewhere in the middle of that focus, between case reviews and design consultations and long drives home after dark, I realized something else. I wasn't rebuilding to prove anything to anyone. I was finally building without permission. I wasn't looking for anyone. That's the part people never believe, but it's the truth. My schedule was packed, my energy rationed carefully between patients, staff, and the slow, deliberate rebuilding of myself. Romance sat firmly at the bottom of my priority list, if it was on the list at all. So when I met Daniel, it didn't register as anything significant at first. We were introduced by a mutual professional contact who thought we might benefit from a conversation. Daniel worked in healthcare administration, consulting with private clinics on operational strategy and compliance. The meeting was framed as practical. Coffee, 30 minutes, exchange notes. We ended up talking for 3 hours. Not about growth charts or expansion models, at least not only that. We talked about medical ethics, about how easily good work gets reduced to numbers by people who've never done it, about hiking trails we liked, and the quiet satisfaction of doing something well without needing applause. What struck me wasn't charm, it was ease. When I mentioned my practice, he asked specific questions, not the kind designed to assess status, but the kind that showed genuine interest. When I talked about a complex case or a technique I was refining, he didn't interrupt or redirect. He listened. absorbed, asked more. At one point, he said, "It sounds like you built something you actually believe in." No qualifiers, no subtext. I didn't tell him about Evan right away. When I did, I kept it factual. No names, no dramatics, just the outline of a relationship that ended because ambition made someone uncomfortable. Daniel nodded once, slowly. "I've been on the other side of that," he said. "Dated someone who needed to feel bigger than me. That never ends well." There was no competition in his tone, no bitterness, just recognition. We started seeing each other quietly after that. No announcements, no rush. Dinners when our schedules aligned, long walks, conversations that didn't feel like negotiations. What surprised me most was how little I felt the need to perform. With Daniel, I didn't explain myself preemptively. I didn't soften my accomplishments or downplay long hours. When I canceled plans because a case ran late, he didn't take it personally. He adjusted, understood. A few weeks in, he met my staff by accident, stopped by the clinic to drop something off. I watched him interact with them naturally, respectfully, asking questions without trying to assert authority. When he left, my office manager raised an eyebrow and said, "He seems solid." She wasn't wrong. Meeting his family came later, almost incidentally. His parents were visiting from out of state, and we joined them for lunch. They were retired professionals, curious but unassuming. They asked about my practice, not in terms of scale or prestige, but impact. His father listened as I explained aesthetic dentistry's effect on patient confidence, nodding thoughtfully. "All medicine works best when people feel seen," he said. There was no evaluation, no silent hierarchy, just respect. Driving home afterward, I realized how tense I'd become around Evan's family without ever naming it. How much energy I'd spent anticipating judgment. With Daniel, that tension didn't exist. I didn't feel like I was being measured against an invisible standard. I felt met. And that was when it hit me. This was what a healthy connection felt like. Not fireworks, not validation, just steadiness, interest, space to be exactly who I was without needing to justify it. For the first time since the breakup, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was noticing what I'd gained. The first time Evan's name came up again, it wasn't dramatic. It was casual, almost careless. I was at a small dinner with colleagues. Nothing formal, just a long table, good food, and people who spoke the same professional language I did. Somewhere between the second course and dessert, a mutual acquaintance leaned in and said, "By the way, Evan's been asking about you." I didn't react right away. I just lifted my glass and took a sip. "Asking what?" I said. "Your practice," she replied. "The expansion, the new consultation studio, and," she hesitated, lowering her voice, "the guy you're seeing." That last part landed differently. Apparently, word had started circulating. Seattle's professional circles are smaller than people like to admit. A successful renovation here, a well-reviewed case there, a few mentions in the right conversations, and suddenly your name travels without you. According to her, Evan sounded regretful. Not frantic, not emotional, just interested. Like someone checking the market after realizing they sold too early. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. 2 days later, I received an email from his mother. The subject line was warm, reflective. She wrote that they'd been thinking a lot about how things had ended, that time and perspective had given them clarity, that they valued the relationship we'd built over the years. She mentioned, almost casually, that they'd been hearing impressive things about my practice's growth and innovation. There was even a line about how they'd always sensed my entrepreneurial potential. The timing was so precise it would have been funny if it hadn't been insulting. The invitation was for dinner. This time, they suggested a restaurant even more upscale than the last. They also asked, politely, if I'd be willing to bring Daniel along, if I was still seeing him. I read the email twice, then a third time. Nothing in it acknowledged what had actually happened. No apology, no accountability, just a careful repositioning, like a chess move made after reassessing the board. That night, I showed the email to Daniel. He read it slowly, expression neutral, then looked up at me. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to ignore it completely. Another part of me is curious." "About what?" "About how they'll act now that they can't dismiss me anymore." He thought for a moment, then nodded. "If you go, don't go for reconciliation. Go for closure." There was no possessiveness in his tone, no ego, just clarity. "I'll come with you if you want," he added. "Not to provoke anything, just so you don't have to walk into that alone." I sat with the idea longer than I expected. I didn't need their approval. That much was clear. But there was something unfinished about the way it had ended, something that still lived in the space between what they'd said and what they'd refused to acknowledge. Eventually, I replied. I accepted the invitation, not because I wanted them back in my life, but because I wanted to look them in the eye as the person they'd dismissed and see if they could do the same. The night of the dinner, I didn't rush getting ready. That alone felt like progress. Months ago, I would have overthought every detail. What to wear, how to present myself, how to strike the right balance between impressive and non-threatening. This time, I dressed the way I always did for important meetings. Tailored, understated, comfortable in my own skin. Daniel noticed my stillness while I adjusted my jacket. "You're not going there to earn anything," he said calmly. "You're going as someone who already moved on." That settled me more than he probably realized. We arrived exactly on time. They were already seated. The table overlooked the water, lights from the city reflecting off the surface in long, broken lines. Evan's parents stood as we approached, overly warm, overly eager. His father shook my hand with both of his, holding it a second too long, smiling in a way I'd never seen before. "Rowena," he said, "it's wonderful to see you again." Then his attention shifted immediately to Daniel. "And you must be Daniel." The way he said his name carried weight, approval, recognition. I noticed it instantly. Evan stood a step behind them, posture rigid, expression carefully neutral. He avoided my eyes at first, then nodded once when our gazes finally met. No smile, no apology, just restraint. The first 20 minutes passed in polite small talk. Weather, traffic, renovations in the neighborhood, nothing personal, nothing real. Evan barely spoke, occasionally adding a comment about mutual acquaintances or recent events, his voice controlled, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Then his father ordered an expensive bottle of wine, and the tone shifted. "Rowena," he said, leaning back slightly, "I want to acknowledge that our last conversation didn't end well. I've had time to reflect." I waited, and I can see now that I misjudged the scope and potential of your profession. There it was, not an apology, a reassessment. His wife leaned in, resting her manicured hand briefly on mine. "We've been hearing wonderful things about your practice expansion. Dr. Harrington, the plastic surgeon, mentioned your work specifically. Seattle's medical community is quite impressed with your innovative approach." The message was clear. Now that others approved, they could too. Evan watched me closely as they spoke, as if waiting to see whether I'd accept this reframing gratefully. I didn't give him the satisfaction. Their attention then shifted to Daniel. They asked about his work with genuine interest, his background, his trajectory. His father even said, "Healthcare leadership has real growth potential." I noticed how carefully that sentence was constructed. Daniel answered politely, never boasting, never deflecting. At one point, Evan's mother said, "Your parents must be very proud." "They are," Daniel replied, evenly. "Though they've always believed the value of work isn't measured by prestige. It's measured by how much it helps people live better lives." The comment landed cleanly. Evan's parents nodded, smiling politely, but I could tell it hadn't registered the way it was meant to. About 45 minutes into the meal, Daniel set his fork down. "I'm curious," he said calmly, "what exactly changed in the past few months?" The table went still. "From what I understand," he continued, "Rowena's skill, work ethic, and passion haven't changed. She's the same professional she was before, so I'm wondering what prompted this sudden shift in perspective." Evan's mother responded first, smoothing her napkin. "Well, of course, seeing community response helps clarify things. Sometimes it takes time to understand someone's trajectory." Daniel nodded. "That makes sense. It's always easier to recognize someone's value once it's been publicly validated." Then he looked directly at Evan's father. "You mentioned earlier that I'm more suited to your circles," he said pleasantly. "Suited to whom exactly?" Silence. Evan's father's smile tightened, his posture stiffened. "I simply meant you share similar professional ambitions," he said coolly. And that was when everything clicked. They hadn't invited me because they regretted what they'd said. They invited me because my success had become visible. Because my name now carried weight in the same circles they cared about. Because I was no longer a liability. The rest of the dinner passed civilly. Evan tried to lighten the mood by referencing old trips, carefully avoiding anything involving his family. I responded politely, briefly, like you would with someone you used to know well and no longer did. When his father asked detailed questions about my practice expansion, I gave general answers. No specifics, no openings. We declined dessert. Outside, the night air felt cool and clarifying. In the car, Daniel glanced at me. I hope I didn't overstep. You didn't, I said. You said exactly what needed to be said. He nodded. Their approval was never about you. It was about what you represented. I watched the city lights pass by, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction. Relief. I thought that dinner would be the end of it. Closure. A clean line drawn between past and present. I underestimated how difficult it is for people like Evan's family to accept a loss of influence, especially when it's quiet and irreversible. 2 weeks later, my phone rang during a lunch break. It was a number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as a representative from an investment group interested in strategic partnerships within luxury healthcare. His tone was smooth, rehearsed. He mentioned my practice by name, complimented the expansion, talked about scalability and regional presence. I listened without interrupting. When he mentioned the firm's backers, I felt the shift immediately. One of them was tied, indirectly but unmistakably, to Evan's father. I declined politely, firmly, hung up. That should have been enough. It wasn't. A week later, my landlord called to let me know there'd been inquiries about the building, an acquisition attempt by a property management company with deep pockets and aggressive timelines. He sounded uneasy. I felt cold. Then came the texts. Unknown numbers, vague introductions. Friends of the family. People asking if I'd ever considered outside investment, whether I was open to advisory input, whether I'd be willing to talk. Daniel noticed before I said anything. You're getting crowded, he said one evening, watching me scroll through yet another message I hadn't asked for. It feels coordinated, I admitted, but I don't understand the endgame. Control, he said simply, or proximity. The most unsettling moment came at a dental conference in Portland. I was walking the exhibit hall between sessions when I saw Evan across the room. He wasn't registered as an attendee. He didn't belong there. He claimed later, through a mutual contact, that he was doing research for a marketing project. It didn't matter. He didn't approach me. He didn't need to. His presence alone felt like a reminder that boundaries meant nothing to him anymore. That night, I called my lawyer. She listened carefully as I laid everything out. The emails, the calls, the timing, the connections. When I finished, there was a pause. This isn't coincidence, she said. It's pressure. We drafted a cease and desist letter the next morning. Precise, controlled. It documented every unwanted contact and made it clear I was prepared to escalate if necessary. When it was sent, something inside me steadied. I didn't feel afraid, I felt resolved. Still, the waiting that followed was heavy. I focused on my work, on Daniel, on the routines that kept me grounded. But I stayed alert, not paranoid, aware. Whatever this was, it wasn't about reconciliation. It was about access. And I wasn't giving it. The cease and desist didn't stop them. It just changed their approach. Instead of direct contact, the noise moved sideways, into rooms I wasn't in, conversations I couldn't hear, questions that reached me secondhand. It was subtle at first. A colleague asking, almost jokingly, whether I'd finally taken on investors. A patient mentioning she'd heard my clinic had powerful backers. I corrected them calmly, every time. But rumors don't need confirmation to spread. They just need repetition. What Evan's family seemed to be implying, without ever saying it outright, was that my practice's recent success hadn't happened in a vacuum. That connections had helped. Advice, influence, money maybe. The kind of vague suggestion that stains without leaving fingerprints. It would have worked on someone else. What they hadn't accounted for was history. People had watched me build this place. My hygienist remembered the early days when I did my own sterilization because we couldn't afford extra staff. Colleagues from dental school remembered the 100-hour weeks and the debt I carried without complaint. Patients had followed me from that first cramped office to the new space because they trusted my hands, not my network. When the whispers reached them, the response wasn't doubt. It was defense. One of my colleagues shut it down publicly at a conference, laughing it off and saying, if Rowena had help, she hid it pretty well while she was pulling 14-hour days. Another corrected someone outright in a patient forum, listing the certifications and case outcomes they'd personally witnessed. Then Evan made a mistake. He didn't call. He didn't email. He posted. It was vague, carefully so. A single paragraph about supporting someone's dream for years, only to be cut out when they finally succeed. No names, no specifics, just enough for people who knew to recognize the target. What he didn't anticipate was the response. Mutual friends commented, not aggressively, just honestly. One mentioned the infamous dinner, another pointed out how his family had always dismissed my work. Someone else asked pointedly why supporting someone meant agreeing with their father when he belittled their career. The post was deleted within hours. Screenshots weren't. After that, everything went quiet. The investment group withdrew their interest. The building acquisition fell through without explanation. The unknown numbers stopped. Evan stopped appearing at industry events he had no business attending. Through a mutual acquaintance, I heard he'd started therapy. I hoped it was true. Genuinely. Growth requires discomfort, and he'd avoided that for a long time. He also started dating someone new, a financial advisor, older, well-established. Someone who fit cleanly into the life he'd always been groomed for. I felt nothing when I heard. No jealousy, no regret. Just distance. The rumors had collapsed under their own weight, and in the process, something unexpected happened. My reputation didn't just survive, it clarified. People knew exactly who I was and how I'd gotten there. That mattered more than vindication, because the loudest truth didn't come from me. It came from everyone who'd been there when I had nothing to gain. It's been 5 months since the last ripple from Evan's family faded out of my life. Long enough for silence to feel permanent. Long enough for the absence of tension to register as peace instead of anticipation. Work has been good, not just successful, right. We're booked 3 months out for consultations now. Not rushed. Not overextended, just steady. The kind of growth you don't brag about because you're too busy maintaining it. Last month, we signed the lease on a second location in Bellevue. It'll focus exclusively on aesthetic dentistry and facial harmony, something I've wanted to build for years, but never gave myself permission to prioritize. Renovations start next month. Spring opening if everything stays on track. I walk through the new space sometimes, hard hat on, plans rolled under my arm, imagining patients sitting across from me, seeing possibilities instead of flaws. Every decision feels intentional, earned. On the personal side, things have settled into something just as solid. Daniel and I got engaged last month. There was no audience, no spectacle, just the two of us on the rooftop of the new office building at sunset. The skyline stretched out in front of us like a promise. He admitted later he knew I was about to ask because I kept touching my pocket and going quiet. Apparently, I'm terrible at surprises. I didn't need one. What mattered was the certainty, the way the decision felt aligned instead of performative. His parents welcomed the news with warmth, real warmth. They asked about the practice not to assess its prestige, but to understand it, to celebrate it. That contrast still hits me sometimes. Not with bitterness, with gratitude. Because looking back now, I see the truth clearly. That dinner, the one that ended everything, wasn't a tragedy. It was a correction. Painful, yes, but precise. Evan's father didn't ruin my life when he dismissed me. He exposed it. He forced me to confront how much of myself I'd been shrinking to fit into rooms that were never meant to hold me. How often I'd mistaken tolerance for acceptance. How easy it is to confuse silence with support when you want something to work badly enough. I don't hate Evan. I don't wish him harm. I hope therapy helps him untangle the expectations he's lived under his entire life. But I'm done explaining myself to people who only see value once it's been validated by others. Success didn't change who I am. It revealed who they were. And that clarity, more than the growth, more than the engagement, more than the second office, is what I'm most grateful for. Thank you to everyone who offered perspective when I needed it most. I never expected something written in shock and disbelief to lead me here, but it did. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Never stay where your worth has to be negotiated. Sometimes walking away isn't losing everything. It's finally choosing yourself. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with me through this story. I know a lot of you have shared similar experiences, being underestimated, quietly dismissed, or asked to make yourself smaller so someone else can feel bigger. If this story resonated with you, know this. You're not imagining it, and you're not asking for too much. Respect should never be conditional. I'm genuinely grateful for everyone who offered support, shared their own stories, or took a moment to reflect alongside me. This community has a way of turning painful moments into clarity, and that matters more than you know. If you found value in this story, feel free to leave a comment, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to stay connected. It helps more than you think, and it keeps these conversations going. I'll see you in the next video, and in the meantime, take care of yourself.